Welcome to the lineup. My name is Lily Dute. I'm on the publicity team here at Soho Press. We're very, very excited to be doing a very special preview event for Ramona Emerson's new book, Exposure, tonight. So thank you for joining us. We've got a really wonderful event for you. Before we jump in, though, I do have a few housekeeping things to go over. First of all, if you haven't been to a lineup event before, this is a collaboration between Soho Press and Mystery to Me Bookstore in Madison, Wisconsin. Um, we will have a little green button here at the bottom. It's loading up now, but you can purchase Ramona's book and Danielle's books at this little link if you are feeling the spirit to support your local indie booksellers. That's always a really wonderful thing and helps us keep the series going. So thank you for doing that in advance. This lineup series supports Soho Crime authors. It puts them in conversation with another, and we sometimes get really special interlocutors like Danielle Trussoni to join us for these as well. So thank you for being here. Finally, we have another event coming up next month, and it's going to be just in time for spooky season. It's a horror fiction event, so we'll take a little bit of a break from crime, but it'll feature two of our horror fiction authors, E.K. Satu and Stuart Neville. It'll be on October 21st at 1 p.m. Central, 2 p.m. Eastern, and you are free to register for that now. If you visit sohocrimelineup.com, you can click and get registered for that event. We'll be doing some special giveaways, and it'll be a really wonderful way to celebrate spooky season. So I'm about to introduce our authors, but we'll be doing a little bit of a Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions at any point during this event, you are welcome to put them in that little chat box on the right side of your screen with the question mark. And Danielle will field those at the very end. And finally, very excitingly, we have a few door prizes to give away. So make sure you're staying towards the end. We have 2 gift cards, and we have a printed, like a special art print of a photo that Ramona took, and it's really beautiful. So one of a kind, signed, would be great. Without further ado, here are the folks that are joining us tonight. We have Ramona Emerson, who is a Dene writer and filmmaker originally from Tohatchi, New Mexico. Her debut novel, Shutter, was longlisted for the National Book Award and the Bram Stoker Award, nominated for the Edgar for Best First Novel, a finalist for the PEN America Open Book Award, the PEN Hemingway Award, the McCavity, Barry, and Anthony Awards for the Best First Novel, and winner of the Lefty Award for Best First Novel. She has a bachelor's in media arts from the University of New Mexico and an MFA in creative writing from the Institute of American Indian Arts. She resides in Albuquerque, New Mexico, where she and her husband, the producer Kelly Byers, run their production company, Real Indian Pictures. Thank you, Ramona. We're so excited to celebrate you today. And Danielle Trussoni is moderating our event. Danielle is the New York Times, USA Today, and internationally best-selling author of 8 books, including The Ancestor, Angelology, and Angelopolis, all New York Times notable books, and The Puzzle Master, chosen by the Washington Post, Barnes & Noble, and Crime Reads as one of the best thrillers of 2023. Recently, 2 of her books appeared on the Best Books Since 2000 list compiled by the editors of the New York Times Book Review. Her debut, Falling Through the Earth, a memoir about her relationship with her father, was selected by the New York Times as one of the best 10 books of the year. She's been featured on 60 Minutes, Time Magazine, and has received cover reviews by the New York Times and the Chicago Tribune. Danielle has been the chair jurist for the Pulitzer Prize in Fiction and was the Dark Matters columnist for the New York Times Book Review for 5 years before leaving to write fiction full-time. Her work has also appeared in The Guardian, Vogue, and Tin House, among other publications. So thank you both for joining us. I'm going to go to the wing now, and thank you all again for being here.
Thank you, Lily. Hi, Ramona. It's just us. It's so great to be here with you. And I'm so glad that we're going to have a chance to have this conversation because I read your first book and just loved it and was thrilled to be able to read an early copy of the new one, Exposure. And I have so many questions for you. Like, I just, as I was reading the first book, I remember, I'm going to tell you a little bit of an inside story here that nobody knows. I was reviewing horror for the New York Times. I had a column, and at the time that your book came out, Sarah Weinman also had a column in the New York Times for crime. And both of us, without knowing, read and put your book in our column. And her column was published first. So she got to keep the review, and I had to cut mine.
Oh,
But I think what that shows to me is that not only, the strength um, and the vividness of your writing, the sort of literary quality of your writing, but also that it kind of moves between a couple genres, right? Like it feels like crime, and it also feels like horror. And that's something that I really love. That sort of it doesn't fit into one neat little box. So I guess I mean I do want to go back and actually talk about you the writer, but let's start with this question first about how do you position your books, because these two could be in many places. You could walk into the bookstore down the street and find it in crime. You could find it in horror. You could find it in just general fiction. What do you think?
well, I did not set out to write any kind of genre. I was
Yeah,
just writing a story about this woman and her self-discovery, of this power that she has, as well as like a discovery of her own culture and embracing her own culture. And I was trying to bridge that through the first and second books, but it really is about family, about history, about healing, and it just happens to touch on a lot of trauma and a lot of things that are part of our lives, that are part of our larger ethos of living. And so it was just trying to flesh it all out. And then when I tried to sell the book, nobody wanted it because we couldn't classify it.
yeah,
And a lot of people were trying to get me to decide whether I was going to write a horror novel, if I was going to write a crime novel, a paranormal novel, a coming of age novel. They wanted me to pick one and stick to that, and then also not go back and forth on the timelines.
right.
So I was making everybody uncomfortable, I think, because I just could not decide. And like I said, I never really set out to write in a crime book or a horror book. I was just telling a story. And it just happened to fall into those particular categories. Um, but even the time and the place of the books are really a statement kind of about like the death of analog technology as a
Yeah,
photographer. If you read the book as a photographer as well, which was a huge part of how the book was put together and a huge theme in the story. When you look at the chapters in Shutter and they're all camera headings or camera models, and I used that to move forward the time so people understood. You could Google that model and know what year it is. You could understand where she was in the world and in that time and place because of a camera model. And I thought that was really interesting to study that, like literally study that. And so that's why it's such a big part of the book. And at the end, towards the end of the chapters about cameras, there's a chapter called iPhone. And that's how you know that we're in 2005, because that was the year that the iPhone came out. So, I guess I just like to do I like to do too much at once. And in this particular case, it worked in my favor.
yeah, like the best books, right?
Yeah.
It's like many things in one thing. I think maybe that's why I was so drawn to it as well. Also, there's a lot. I grew up in the Midwest. My father was a Vietnam vet. I grew up in an environment where there, not necessarily just from my father, but where there was a lot of violence. I was in a lot of people don't know this about me. I was in a school shooting when I was in fifth grade. And I felt very connected, especially in the new book, in Exposure, to the level of violence that's in this book. And um, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your experience violence? I know that's a really broad question, and
Okay.
and you can answer that in any way that you want to. But when I was reading it, I found myself really connecting with, for example, the Montano children,
Yeah.
who opened the book,
Mhm.
and feeling that there was no way I was going to stop reading this book because I wanted to, I wanted to, I found myself wanting to have that connection that Rita had with them, right?
Yeah.
And Rita is this wonderful connection between violence and your reader and our heart, right? That we can see how much she cares. So I wonder, forgive me if this is too personal, but in your own life and when you were a child, or what draws you to talk about that level of violence in your work?
Uh, I think it's a big part of it is just because um, it's been a part of my life. I've seen it. I studied it, especially for this book. Um, but when you work in forensics for as long as I did, um, I was always just shocked by the level of violence that happened in our city and in these court cases, whether it was a criminal case all the way up to a divorce case. There was violence and there was, sad stories just about everywhere I went when I did that work. Um, and I carried a lot of it with me for many, many years. And um, I think I feel like we need to talk about it because I've also been making a docu series that over the last 10 years that concentrates on border town violence and about the things that happen in these communities that surround the Navajo Nation. So I've really been studying not only as an author but as a documentarian about the levels of violence that happen to Native people in Gallup, in Farmington, in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and also in places in Arizona, and talking about how Indigenous people are so often the victims of these crimes, whether it is from living on the streets and being victimized by just people in general, like in Albuquerque, or whether it's an industry like alcohol or drugs that take people out in another city, or whether it's the police that take Native people out in another city. um, it has just been, especially in the last 16 and 10 years, it has been absolutely a part of my everyday life because I feel like these are stories that nobody hears. And when I tell these stories and I tell people about what happens in these towns and these border towns, and I've done the research, I see it. I've talked to historians, I've talked to cultural and cultural leaders and elders about it. And so um, I understand what's going on in these towns, and I feel like it's my duty to tell people about it, whether I write about it or whether I make a film about it. It's always going to be part of my world as a storyteller, and um, I have to make people aware of what's going on, and that's where it all comes down to. So yeah, it has affected me, and it's traumatizing, and I have nightmares, and I have a lot of ghosts that memories that haunt me about things that I've seen. But I think everybody does, and I just decide to put it down on the page, and I give it to Rita. I give it to the Montanos. I give it over to the birds, and I think that helps. And doing the documentaries as well, giving voice to those issues also helps because I feel like I'm doing something. I'm making their voices heard. I'm giving victims a voice. So I guess it's the same way with words, you know.
Yeah. One thing that's really struck me as I've read both of these books is the level of um, the lack of anger in Rita, right? Like, like my sister is a social worker in Milwaukee, right? In one of the worst zip codes in the country
Yeah.
for violence. And, every once in a while she just has to get angry, right?
Yeah.
And but incredibly interesting about Rita, and I think the reason you can stay with her throughout all of those experiences is that she has this sort of peacefulness. And I think it might have to do with her connection with the ghosts and what she sees. And I wonder, how, this is a kind of a craft question, I guess, about writing, is like, how do you make a narrator, or a main, not really a narrator, but a central character who can hold together such different, because you have a lot of different characters, a lot of different events happening. How did you come to make her out of your experiences?
Well, I knew I wanted to write about a woman who was strong. I had a lot of influence from my grandma, my mom, my aunts, cousins, and they were all very strong women. And so I knew I wanted to write a strong woman character. But I also wanted to give her a power that would be something that would be questionable to her culture. And I remember when I was working in forensics, my grandma would get so worried about me, looking at what I was looking at. And during my early days there, during that time, he took me to the medicine man several times to pray for me because she was worried. And I thought of those times, and I thought about what would it be like if that the world of death was such a big part of a Navajo woman's life? Because as you know, or maybe you don't, the biggest taboo in Navajo culture is death, and you don't talk about it. You don't talk about any of that. So it was, for me, writing Rita was about giving voice to that too, and giving a voice to our grief. Also about that's a big part of the no about Navajo cultures. Like, you can't grieve, you can't say their names. Like, you have 4 days to grieve, and then after that, you can't even think about it anymore. Like, you have to let them go. Like, there's so many rules that are involved in Navajo culture, and I just wanted her to be able to carry all that responsibility with her, and also carry a huge reverence for death, and a huge reverence for these people who have crossed over and who have decided to talk to her, because that's something that would be unheard of in the Navajo culture, that she could talk and that she would willingly talk to ghosts or talk to the dead or have that connection to death or the afterworld. So it's super taboo. So when I was putting this character together, I was like, I got to give all of this to her, because my grandma was like, had a million things going on all her life, all the time. And she was juggling so many things, working, all of us kids, my mom too. And they are always cool as a cucumber, like, it didn't matter. We could be having no money, and we'd be, no food, no money. What are we going to do? We got to wait. And they were always, it's all going to work out. We just have to believe it's going to be okay. And it was always okay. And I just thought to myself, that's that person that Rita has to be. And that's not me. I'd be freaking out.
I know, me too. I was like, oh my goodness, how does she handle all of this? I would be.
Yeah, I would be totally stressed out and yelling at everybody. And I would not be able to absorb it like Rita does. But I think that's a lot too of Navajo culture. Like, we're taught to be that way, like, not to complain, to do what we got to do and keep our heads down. And it's just not our thing to complain or make an issue or make a thing about ourselves. And so I really wanted to play that out in Rita, and I think she does it very well.
Yeah, she seems to me like this perfect vessel for entering into some of the things that are happening. And I noticed, especially in this new book, there's so much corruption, right?
Yeah.
The church, the police, there's just corruption everywhere. And so much of the violence stems from, the Montano father. There's so much of the violence stems from this corruption. And yet she's almost like, I don't know, she's our raft through it. And and it's
she's
really
aware. So,
and I think that, maybe that's why people could, for me anyway, like, why I enjoy these books so much, because we're allowed to view it from a distance and almost like a safe space.
Right.
Yeah. Anyway, I want to shift just a little bit and ask you about your path to becoming a writer. Now, I think that, you do a lot. You do a lot of storytelling in other mediums. You have worked in film and you're a photographer. But so what specifically was your path to writing? Was it something that you wanted to do for your whole life, or did you just end up finding that medium?
I've said this before. I hate writing. I've avoided it. I'm good at it. I've been told by different people, my grandmother, first of all, my mom, they always say, you're such a good writer. And I just was like, well, great. But I never wanted to put that into action. I had never had any desire to do that. So, I mean, I made high school teachers, all those people always told me, you should be a writer. So I became a filmmaker. I think I felt like I could tell stories visually easier. It was the process of telling a story visually with a camera was easier than putting it down on paper for me for many years. And I avoided writing. When I was little, I would write stories, adventure stories or horror stories, things like that, but nothing serious. But I was kind of in the dumps because I had just finished the documentary and I was hoping it was going to get into more festivals than it did, and it just didn't turn out. The story I wanted to tell was great, and nobody seemed to want to respond to it, and I was really depressed about being a filmmaker. Felt like I had wasted all my life doing it, and this opportunity came up to be in a writing workshop at this place called Los Luceros up in northern New Mexico. And somebody invited me, you should come up, meet Joan and have a day writing. And I went up there and I wrote a couple short stories while I was there with some writing prompts from Joan. And Joan Tewksbury ended up being my mentor for like a year and a half. And I went to her writing workshops like every 2 months. And I started to write stories, and part of it was the beginnings of Shutter. I was writing stories about my grandmother, and I was writing stories about forensics. I was writing some stories about Navajo culture and, just kind of horror stories. I didn't think anything. So at the time, my MFA program started, and I got notice of it. And I thought, oh, it's a low residency program. Great time to get my MFA. I've been wanting to do that for a long time, but I never have time. This will afford me the time. So I was going to apply as a screenwriter and take the screenwriter track. And I called Joan Tewksbury and I asked her if she would write me a letter of recommendation. And she said, what are you going to do? And I said, I'm going to study screenwriting. She said, no. Recommendation, and I was like, why not? And she said, because I don't want you to be going into screenwriting, I want you to go into fiction, and I think you should be writing what you're writing at workshop, and you should just give your films a break for a while. And I was like, fiction, okay. And so I took the short stories I had written in workshop and I applied for my MFA program, and I got in, and I was in fiction, and I had no idea what I was doing. And I had a lot of great mentors, like Eden Robinson, Amanda Boyden, Sherman Alexie, Ismet Prichek, Manuel Gonzalez. I mean, a lot of authors came in and asked a lot of questions and did a lot of work with me. And, that's how and by the time I graduated, I had a first draft of my novel. So I did it in 2 years while I was at my program. And that's how I became a writer.
It's really inspiring. I think a lot of people who are here are aspiring writers. I know that a lot of people that come to different events, I live in Mexico, and there's a writing conference here that I'm part of, and there's lots of aspiring writers. And so the question is always like, how does it happen, right? Because, it's not always a linear path, and it's like one person, as with you, it's one person can change the course
Yeah.
of everything in our lives for writers. Have you found that, are you teaching at all, or are you mentoring anyone, or have you made connections with other younger writers?
Well, I have taught the last couple of summers with the Emerging Dene Writers Institute at Navajo Technical University. So all of my students have been young Navajo writers, and I am really supportive of that program. It's so important to give voice to these Navajo writers. A lot of them live on the reservation and they don't have the resources to get their work seen and read by people outside of the reservation. And so it's really important for us to do that, to give them feedback, to help them in their writing, to get them into the programs. So far, I've seen 3 of my students go on to get into MFA programs or finish their BFA programs because I told them, you know, your writing is important and these stories are incredible and you can't be scared about sharing them with the world and don't worry about what you think your people will say or think about you. Just tell your story. That was a big problem with me. I was so afraid to tell this story. Like I didn't realize how afraid I was until it was too late. Like
Yeah, we're all sort of
out.
like blessed by being totally naive with the first book, right?
Absolutely. I mean, it was like, oh my God, it was like a week before it was coming out, and I was like, what
Oh
are now
shit.
people going to say to me about what I just wrote? I just wrote this whole book of death, and everybody's going to hate me, and all the medicine men are going to come to my readings and chew me out. I mean, seriously, I was scared. And
And
I
did it
think
happen? Did it
no,
happen? No.
not at all. And a lot of people all the Dene people who have come to the readings have been very supportive. Um, I've had questions about why I wrote about them. I've had, you know, people have questions, but nobody has been angry. Nobody has been angry with me for what I wrote because I think a lot of people were thinking what Rita's thinking, which is, do we really have to believe in all of these archaic Navajo belief systems and superstitions when we live in a modern world? And how do we change our belief system as contemporary Dene people living in a contemporary Dene world? And how can we move forward? Well, we continue to hold on to these ancient superstitions. And so I think a lot of people had thought that, but nobody wanted to say it. And they were afraid that if we said it, we were going to blow up because, like, that's what we're always told. Like, oh, we're going straight to hell, we're going to blow up, we're going to die, or something horrible is going to happen to us because we asked for it. Anyway, so I think a lot of people were just kind of like, yeah, but what if? And I said it out loud. And I think people were kind of like, thank you for saying it out loud. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to heal from our trauma or to mourn our people, like, and making it okay, because we've always been taught that it's not okay. So in that way, I think it's important. And that's what I always tell those students is you know, your stories are important and we have to make sure and get you out there. Right now, I am assistant professor at the University of New Mexico. I teach in the film and media department. So I'm a film teacher. But I have taught at the Institute of American Indian Arts and then also at Navajo Technical University. But I just started teaching at the university, so it's a new experience for me.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't yeah, I can imagine, you know, after working in film and having basically, I'm guessing, freelance, right? Except for when you were
Yes.
working in forensics, was what kind, can you describe that experience of working in forensics? That I'm imagining, was that freelance as well, or was that something where you were part of a department?
I actually was the manager of the video section of
Hmm.
this business, and he had a private business. My boss was named Jerry Goff, and he ran a forensic business here in Albuquerque for like 40 years before he hired me. And we worked for the Albuquerque Police Department. We worked for lawyers. We worked for all types of people. And I did video of everything from crime scenes to traffic studies to insurance litigation videos where you have to go in after accidents and like document the vehicles, the crime scenes, kids on the, and it's mostly for insurance. When it gets to where I worked, it was for insurance. We very rarely had to go out. I came out on crime scenes after and measured things and went with the insurance adjusters and filmed everything and photographed everything. That was my job. And I did a lot of depositions, and my main job was doing day in the life documentaries. So I spent a lot of time doing those. So it's like spending if a client is hurt, they sue somebody, maybe their doctor hurt their baby in childbirth, they got in a car accident, whatever it was. It was my job to go and spend like a whole day or two with them and film every aspect of their life so that a jury could see how the accident or the egregious behavior of a doctor changed their lives or their family's lives forever. So that was my job. And I got most of my work was doing that. I'd make films and for lawyers so that they wouldn't have to go to trial, because once my videos were entered into evidence, they never wanted the jury to see them because they were always so disturbing and hard to watch. It's hard to watch somebody who is a vibrant like teenager and about ready to graduate from high school, or a little baby who's 4 or 5 years old and something happens to them and now they have a trait, or that their parents have to clean out, or now they can't talk or move for themselves anymore and their parents' lives have changed forever. And it's heartbreaking to spend that and invest that time and be a part of their lives, and then you put this video together and then you never see them again and you hope that their trial goes well. And maybe that has a lot to do with why Rita is so compassionate and invested in her victims and what she films, because you become part of their lives. You really do. And you never forget them. You never forget their faces or their names. And it's hard. But that's a lot that I worked. That's mostly what I did at work.
It seems like if you could imagine a kind of perfect study for being a writer, for capturing people's lives and having a way in, right? Because I think the hardest thing for a writer is getting underneath the skin of other people's lives and being able to see it. And not only were you let in with your camera and making a film, but you were constructing the edit, I imagine, in a way to tell a very dramatic story.
Absolutely.
So it seems like you were almost this is an apprenticeship for writing novels, especially the crime or horror novels that or the novels that you're writing. I don't want to put them in a bucket because they're not really in either of those. But and it's funny, probably at the time you might have been like, this is really hard, but there's something beautiful that came out of it. So it's interesting that you're able to use that in your work.
It was hard at the time, and I had like the worst hours. I had some crazy days, but I think it gave, I think it just kind of, it helped me also as a documentarian, because I was able to learn how to become trusted. I was able to embed myself into people's homes and people's communities to tell documentary stories. And you do that, you hang out with them before you even bring your camera out. So you just become their wallpaper, and they're like, oh, hi, Ramona, you're here. And then they forget that you're there all day and you're filming them, and you just become part of everything. And you become a fly on the wall. You become, that person. And it takes trust and compassion to do that. You can't come in and just be a jerk and expect to get a compassionate film out of it, because it'll show. Like, you have to gain trust. You have to be compassionate. You have to be trustworthy. So that's a really big thing of when it translates into something like exposure. Like the Montano case was really based on a real case that happened here in New Mexico. And I wanted to give reverence to that family that lost their lives by giving them a voice. Even though I've changed all these details about it, I know in my head that's the case I studied and I remember, and that really affected me enough that I would put it into a book like this. And that was very similar to Shutter. Every single crime that happened in Shutter was based on a crime that either I studied as part of my studies with APD, or it was something that actually happened to me while I was working in forensics. So that's, I think, also lends to the element of reverence, of giving space and voice to these victims and these people. Yeah.
Well, you can feel it when you read it.
Good. I'm glad.
And I feel that. I felt that. There was a moment at the end of Exposure when we see Margarita Montano again, and
Yeah.
you know, your heart kind of breaks after you've been through all of the things that happened in the book, and then to see her again.
Yeah.
It was really very touching. And I'm wondering, I think I read somewhere that there's 3 books with Rita.
Yeah. Yes.
And I wonder if you've started to think about how she's going to move forward in the next book, or if you're holding off on that.
Oh no.
No
My
holding back.
My editor Juliet would be happy to hear that the outline is coming along very nicely.
Very good. Excellent.
It's happening, I swear. And yeah, and I think people are really gonna like the third installment. There's so much stuff in here that people have been asking for and asking me about, and yeah, everyone's gonna be, I think, very pleased.
Well, I know I will be. I'm waiting for it. I can't wait. And I know that I wanted to take some questions, and I was told that there would be a little box at the bottom, but I don't see a little box at the bottom. So I wonder if Lily could jump in and ask questions from people who are typing them in the chat box. We can't hear you, Lily. You're muted.
Oh, you're right. Yeah, we don't have any questions yet, but if folks have some questions, feel free to put them in, and I can read them as they come in. Otherwise, Danielle, I don't know if you have anything else you wanted to ask.
Well, I do. I have a bunch of things. I feel like we could go out and talk all night. But one thing so I told you, I mentioned earlier that I was in a school shooting when I was a kid. I was in a Catholic school, and the crime happened. The murder of the priest. Someone came in and murdered the priest and a lay minister and a janitor in the church where the kids go to church. And so my history has been very interwoven with violence and religion. Yeah. I stopped going to that school. My parents took me out of that school after. But I think certain experiences in our lives fuse. And, I've written books about violence and religion, essentially, a bunch of novels about that subject. And I noticed in Exposure that there's an enormous strand of the Catholic Church and violence, and especially Brother Gabriel, obviously, and but even what happened to him, right? What happened, and so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that and your experience with the Catholic. I don't know if you have any experience with the Catholic Church. I don't know, where that is coming from in your work, but it was really interesting to me, and I read it very closely.
Well, Catholicism is, like, I think, a huge part of New Mexico culture. And it doesn't matter whether you're native or you're Hispanic or what, everybody seems to be Catholic here. And I'm Catholic. I went to Catholic school too. I went all the way to high school. I went to Catholic school. And I've heard stories from all over the place, good and bad, about priests, about the church. There's a lot of scandals that go on here in New Mexico involving priests who are known pedophiles or known, violent perpetrators. that are allowed to be moved to Native communities and serve in the parishes here on the Pueblo or around Native communities, around border town communities. And there's a huge history of that kind of thing going on, not only here in New Mexico, but on other Native reservations. And so I really wanted to give that kind of a spotlight, but then also give a spotlight to the fact that a lot of these people who go on to hurt people or that have these kind of sordid, violent beliefs have them because they are victims themselves, especially of the Catholic Church. And then I also wanted to touch on the ancient Catholic sect of all the penitentes that live in northern New Mexico. And I don't think people know about the penitentes and about how devoted they were to God. It's so devoted that even their own church, the Catholic Church, had them kicked out of the church because they were so devoted.
Crazy too much devoted. Devotion, too much faith.
Too much. So there's so much Catholic history that I read about and that I experienced growing up in Catholic school and being in comparative religions and having these discussions about Catholicism and about tribal communities. And there's a lot of violence surrounding colonialism and the Pueblo Revolt, all the Pueblo communities, the Navajos and the Apaches in this state. We have a long history of priests coming in and church coming in and just killing people. And so I just took all of that, I guess, rage from all of the history that I know of and that I've read and that I've seen and put it into this book, because I feel like we also have that same issue with the police department here in Albuquerque.
Yeah. Yes.
We have one of the most corrupt police departments in the country, and we're always being investigated by the DOJ. And so those two things, I was like, we have to continue to talk about these corrupt cops, but we also have to say that this other governing body of our state, which happens to be the church, is also very evil. And that we have to talk about that. And we have to bring that history to the forefront. And so I gave the world Brother Gabriel. And I think he's a good amalgamation of all of these things wrapped up into one character. And I thought he was, he's super creepy.
He's super creepy, but what's interesting is that the creep factor, if you want to call it that, happens kind of slowly. Because in the beginning, I'm there with
you. Feel bad.
Right. I'm like, oh, he's going to help Rosemary. He's what a good guy. He's taking her out for dinner.
Right.
He's eating this hamburger. I was there. I was really feeling like he was going to be a force of good. And
well, he thinks he is.
Yeah. And so, exactly.
And that's kind of the church's mentality, I think, really too. So like they think they're doing God's work.
Right. And I thought it was interesting that, you go into his point of view so closely.
Yeah.
And so tell me, so I wrote a book called Angelology. It's very different. There's, the idea of angels that one finds in your book, but can you tell me like how this evolution came about of having him imagine these things?
Oh, yeah. Well, he had started out, I had tried to give him, because of the beatings that he took when he was a young boy, I wanted to give him some kind of physiological issue that he would be dealing with. So it wasn't just that he was evil,
right.
I think he truly was good, but there's somewhere, just like his father, somewhere in there, something was wrong. And the longer he ignored it, or the longer he listened to it, I guess, the worse it became for him. And originally he was going to have like seizures. I had him having medical episodes, and like early drafts had a lot of that kind of stuff in there.
Mm-hmm.
But as we moved forward and into the edit, Juliet and Nick were both very supportive of the fact that he didn't need that crutch. Like he didn't need the crutch of a like a physiological problem like epilepsy or uh, you know, something major going on like a brain bleed or something happening to him to do this, because he's already so traumatized and he's gone through so much and seen so much in his,
Yeah.
that he doesn't need any kind of physical ailment to go off the deep end. Like this is literally somebody trying to find something to reach for because he has nothing. You know, like he feels like he has no family. He's pretty alone, and he needs something to believe in, and that's how it starts, and it turns into something completely dark and different for you. Yeah,
I think that's why that character is so compelling, because he's so complicated. He's not a
it is.
villain. He's a
No,
villain. He's a very layered, he's very human.
yeah, and that's what I really, even bad people are human, or they were human at some point, and you know, you kind of have to give them pause for that. I don't think people would have been invested in the story had we not liked him a little bit. Like if he was just horrible the whole time and just, you know, a cold-blooded killer, I don't think he would have translated the same.
Yeah.
He kills to protect, like in his mind. He kills
Yeah.
to he kills to save people. He kills to give people a better life. This is his mentality.
Yeah.
So in his own mentality, he's not doing anything bad. He's helping people. So yeah. But I felt like I needed to, in the same way that I give people reverence, these victims reverence, I needed to give this guy a little space too, because we had to believe that he was also a man of the cloth, but he was also having these demons, and I think a lot of priests have those same demons.
Yeah, so we're almost at the end, but I wanted to just pull out a line from the end of your book that has stayed with me, and I'm just going to paraphrase it. But Rita, toward the end of the book, there's a moment where she hears the voices of her ancestors singing.
Yeah.
And I love that moment. And there's a moment, I don't want to give too much away for people, but there's also a moment where she feels like the violence might stop, right? And that she's home.
Yeah.
And I love something that was really wonderful finishing the book is that it ends on that note of hope.
Right.
And there's so much darkness in the book,
Yeah.
but it's a very hopeful book. So I guess it's not really a question, but it's just me saying that I appreciate that. And if anyone out there, hasn't read this book, I would really encourage you to click on this little link right here, buy the book here and read it, because it's one of those books that are, you're not gonna, oh, she's clicking
Not
very
quite there.
hard. Click again. I'm gonna click right now. But it's
Well, I'm so glad that
you.
it was hopeful. I'm so glad it was hopeful for you.
It did feel hopeful, and I'm really interested to see how the last book ends too, because I'm sure in your mind, I know that I've written books that are part of a series, like there's the individual book and then there's the whole, the way that you see the whole thing.
Sorry, I keep whacking my desk.
So.
It's very, I mean, this is my first book, so it's crazy that of course I've jumped off and did a trilogy like right away. Like I must be out of my mind.
Might as well jump in, right?
Might as well jump in. And it's so hard to decide how to leave her. Like the third book, like how to end that story and that character. And I've had a lot of pushback about only doing 3. But I also want to write other things. I want to write other things besides Rita.
Of course. So, yeah. I mean, you can end with 3 and then in 10 years go back maybe. Or
that's what everybody keeps telling me. She'll be back.
She'll be back. Everybody wants her to see her again. She's like a friend.
Yeah. And I'll miss her. I will. Like even once that third book is done, I'm sure I will miss her.
Yeah.
Because she's fun to write. And she can get into all kind of mischief that I was never able to.
Of course, I mean, that's why we write, right? We
That's right.
vicariously go with places that we would never be able to go.
That's it. That's it.
Well, Ramona, this was so much fun. I just want to check with Lily. Were there any questions?
We do, yes. Penny, thank you for asking the question. Penny asks, yes, it is. Penny asks, has the trilogy been optioned for movie or streaming rights? It seems perfect for translation to the screen.
Well, it has been optioned, Penny, and I have been told for a TV series, and I have been told that's all I can say. But it is being optioned for a TV series, and I think in the early talks with them about it, it has to be a TV series just because it's too much story to fit into like a 2-hour film. I think that would be cramming too much information into 2 hours. So, and there's so many directions that you could take it with this series, and so much other cool stuff that Rita could get into. So let's really keep our fingers crossed and hope that it all works out. I'm hoping it does because I think it would be good.
Penny says yay.
Yay, Penny.
Just to echo what you were saying, Danielle, I mean, we talked about a lot here, and there is so much more to exposure than even like what could be covered. So truly, we're really excited for it to come out in a couple of weeks, and definitely click that button down there. And those books will be signed by Ramona as well. They'll come with book plates that have been signed. So extra special memory from the event. I did before we log off, I wanted to announce the winners of the door prizes.
Ooh.
Very exciting. For our $25 gift card, we have Jenny Kempfert. So congratulations,
All right, Jenny.
For the $50 gift card, we have Ellen Brown. Congrats. And then for our grand prize, which is the one-of-a-kind photo print taken by Ramona, we have Bronwyn Mears. So congratulations. Thank you all for joining me. I'll email the three of you now to kind of tell you about the logistics of those things. But thank you again for joining, Danielle and Ramona, if you have anything to say before we log off.
No, it's just been a real pleasure. Thanks for having me here to do this.
Thank you so much, Danielle. It was an absolute blast, and I'm so glad that you liked it.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you. We'll see you next time.